Hello everybody and welcome to Fistful of Cards. I'm your best friend Patrick Fair, and today we're happy to announce the first in our Doomtown deck building series. Just as a side note, this is not a how to play guide. If you're looking for a video on that, we do have one on the same channel. I recommend that you go and check it out if you're still trying to learn the rules of the game. This guide is more for new players who are looking for some direction in deck building, or ingrained players who are maybe looking to pick up a couple of new tips or tricks on this particular deck. So with that out of the way, let's get started. And what better way to get started in the deck building series than with the Law Dogs Bounty Hunter deck, one of the oldest decks in Doomtown Reloaded. I would highly recommend that anyone who wants to improve at deck building or the game in general learn how to play this deck, as it emphasizes two major aspects of Doomtown deck building. One, it sets a goal that's really easy to understand, and two, the deck list reinforces that goal at every opportunity. So what am I talking about with goals? The goal of this deck is to create shootouts that our opponent can't refuse, and to make those shootouts as impactful as possible through our shootout control cards. And how do we accomplish this? Well, let's go through the list. Let's start off by talking about the combo that is sort of the deck's namesake. First, we have the Law Dogs Core Home, which allows us to make our opponent's dudes wanted. And we have the Bounty Hunter card, which allows us to call out our opponent's wanted dude without them being able to refuse. So already we've covered one section of our goal. We've created a way to generate shootouts that our opponents can't refuse. The second half of that goal is going to be enforced by the rest of the deck. So let's talk a little bit about structure for a second. If I go here to value, you can see that we're primarily a 2-value deck. Now that means that for those ingrained in Doomtown, that we're a 16-16X deck. Those not familiar with Doomtown lingo, basically that just means that we have 16 5s, 16 6s as our two primary values, and most of the rest of the deck makes up the X, which means it's just the rest of the cards in our deck. We do have 8 8s, and these three values are going to be our core values for playing poker, and our goal in this deck is to create legal full houses, which is a very common goal in a lot of Doomtown structures. Going back to our suits here for a second, we're going to go through our clubs and our hearts and our diamonds and our spades, obviously. Let's start off with clubs. We're going to talk a little bit more about Bounty Hunter to start with. Bounty Hunter, in addition to allowing us to call out a wanted dude and they can't say no, it also generates a 2-stud gunslinger token, which is extremely important as it gives us a couple of things that we really want. One, it gives us stud dudes, which is just generically good. Two, it gives us a token dude, which we can use to cover casualties, so our deck instantly becomes better at tying our opponent, because if you remember from our Doomtown How to Play video, anytime you would tie your opponent in a shootout, you both take one casualty, which means that they could lose a regular dude and we can lose a token, and so we come out on top in that situation. In addition, being a stud is very relevant, as you'll see it with some of our synergistic cards that kind of take advantage of that. Going through the rest of the deck, we have these three cards: Pistol Whip, Faster on the Draw, and Point Blank, which round out our shootout tricks, I guess you could call them. Some of them are shootout cards. One of them is a resolution card. Pistol Whip is just a generically good card. I would recommend trying to fit a lot of the cards that we're going to talk about today in a lot of decks, because they are just generically powerful cards. Pistol Whip allows us to boot one of our dudes to send an opposing dude home booted. Now, there are two basic uses for this card. The first one is that you're going to target dudes that are your opponent's big, scary studs. Your opponent's 3 studs, 4 studs, 5 studs, etc. Now you can send those dudes home, and so they just get immediately worse at fighting, especially if they're one of those decks that sort of put all their eggs in one basket, and they only have one dude in their starting posse or in their deck in general that can really fight. But our deck is really actually going to use this for the second usage of it, which is to target dudes like Willamay or Henry Morin. Pistol Whip allows us to get rid of one of the sort of disadvantages of a deck like this. in that since we're not overly interested in getting into a lot of shootouts so much as we are into making the few shootouts that we get into very, very impactful, cards like Willamay really put a damper on our deck. And if you look at Willamay, she's not only a very cheap dude, but she can also ace herself to send all your own dudes home booted, which basically allows you to run away from a fight that's going badly without losing anyone important. However, if Willamay is not in the fight, she can't use this ability. And so primarily you're going to be targeting dudes like Henry Moore and like Willamay, these cheap, crappy dudes that are there only to soak bullets. You're going to be targeting those dudes in order to make sure that your cards that are more impactful land, and when you win a shootout, you win by a lot, and you make sure that your opponent has to sacrifice real powerful dudes with influence. That's primarily what we're going to be going after in this deck, and Pistol Whip lets us do that. Faster on the Draw is once again a very generic basic shootout that we're going to take a lot of advantage of. We get a bullet, our opponent loses 2 bullets, and if we have a deputy, they become a stud. Because we're running Law Dogs, we do have deputies, as they are the only faction that currently has any deputies. That could change, but as of the filming of this video, there are only deputies in Law Dogs. And so we can turn our deputies into studs, which you'll see later once we go through the dudes. It does affect a few of our guys. The +1 bullet we're going to actually take advantage of, and the -2 bullet, obviously, again, we want to make our opponents worse. We want to take advantage. We want to make these shootouts as one-sided as possible, and making your opponent's dudes worse is just as good as getting rid of them. Continuing down the line, we have Point Blank. Point Blank is a card that everybody should pay a lot of attention to. Point Blank is arguably one of the best cards in the game, and you should try and put it in as many decks as you can actually get it to fire with. Point Blank allows us to boot a stud in our posse in order to ace an opposing dude with less bullets. Now, we don't get to pick that dude, which is important. Also, another reason why we run Pistol Whip is we can get rid of dudes that we don't want our opponent to pick when we grab our Point Blank. But this card is just generically powerful. Booting a dude to ace a dude is a very powerful effect. And as we've talked about, a lot of these things have synergy with it. Pistol Whip allows us to control who gets picked. Faster on the Draw allows us to control who gets picked by boosting our bullets and lowering our opponent's bullets. We can make Philip Swinford a stud and give him the capability to ace 2 stud dudes that we've lowered to 0 stud dudes with Faster on the Draw. Bounty Hunters can boot for both Pistol Whip and Point Blank, and they are 2 studs, which means anything that's less than them can be a target of Point Blank. So as you can see, we've created this very synergistic package of clubs here that takes advantage of our opponents getting weaker and then further pushes. Again, high impact cards. We're going to keep talking about that throughout this deck building video, is we're taking advantage of high impact cards. Our final club is an anti-cheating card that's going to lead us into Hearts over here in a second. It's Not What You Know. It's Not What You Know is a very high swing cheating resolution card. When your opponent cheats, you'll lower their hand rank by 4. This not only is very likely to prevent you from taking casualties, it also is very likely for your opponent to actually lose the shootout. If they pull a cheating 4 of a kind, a cheating full house, all of a sudden they're behind you by a considerable number of casualties. Once again, we come back to the concept of high impact shootouts as opposed to a lot of shootouts. However, a downside of this card is you might have noticed that this card costs 2. That's that number in the lower left-hand corner. And Bounty Hunter also costs 2. And some people might be looking at this and say, well, that's a lot of money, and I'm a little uncomfortable with having to rely on that. And that's fine, because we're going to talk about a couple of alternative options. I personally don't think, given that we do run a decent amount of deeds, and a lot of our deeds can generate some steady income, and we're pretty good at protecting our deeds since we have such a shootout-oriented deck, I'm not personally overly concerned with that. However, if you are, here are a couple of options to change it up. Number 1 is Bottom Dealing. Bottom Dealing is a very, very high impact card. It's arguably the best anti-cheating card in the game. However, it does have a very big downside, which is that it could give your opponent the same hand that they already had, or it could give them a better hand than the one that they currently have, in which case you would basically have not played a card at all or made things worse. However, when it fires, which is most of the time, it is a very, very high impact card and can oftentimes leading to you just winning the game, especially when coupled with these other cards that we've been talking about. However, if this also makes you uncomfortable, which I completely understand, the other options that we really have are Coach Whip and Ricochet over here, the brand new anti-cheating card Ricochet. I'm going to suggest Ricochet, but I'm going to talk about why first through Coach Whip. Now, we can't really take advantage of Coach Whip's utility, which is kind of with Coach Whip and Ricochet, they both do functionally the same thing. They both essentially ace an opposing dude. However, Coach Whip can be utilized during low ball in order to just boot dudes that you don't want to see, which would be powerful with our deck. We could preemptively pistol whip essentially dudes in our opponent's posse. However, we don't run enough anti-cheating cards to really take advantage of these cards, and we can't be comfortable enough just throwing away anti-cheating cards that could be used in shootouts during low ball. So Coach Whip really isn't an option for us. So I would recommend that if you don't want to run bottom dealing, and if you don't want to run It's Not What You Know, I would recommend running Ricochet. Now, Ricochet is very similar to Coach Whip. It basically gets rid of a dude, which is very, very powerful. If your hand is legal, we're looking to make legal full houses, so obviously our hand is going to be legal a lot of times. We don't take casualties. However, the downside of this card is that it doesn't win you the fight. Most of the times you'll punish your opponent, which is on theme. You know, it's very scary if your opponent has to take a casualty from Ricochet. They also have to take a casualty from Point Blank. Those can be very, very powerful plays. However, it doesn't often win you the shootout, so we don't get to just give our opponent a bunch of casualties. Instead, this helps you from not losing the fight. It doesn't make you win the fight. So really between Ricochet and those other two cards that we talked about are really where you're going to want to be with your club anti-cheating card, and I think they're all viable. I encourage you to test and figure out which one works best for your particular playstyle. The other anti-cheating card that we're running going into Hearts is Quick Draw Handgun. Quick Draw Handgun is a 2-cost weapon that gives you +1 bullet. It is a good, and its cheating resolution lets you swap hands with the cheating player. Most of the time, this card is not going to fire. It's just going to be on the table as a presence and maybe discourage your opponent from cheating, which is very, very important for a deck like this, where our opponent not cheating means that we're very likely to tie them, and we can take advantage of ties by having a more powerful deck, obviously, as we've talked about time and time again going through here. However, it is a weapon. It does give us a bullet. The bullet does provide some synergies with Point Blank and just being useful. It is a weapon, which means if our opponent's trying to do some sort of melee shenanigans, we can turn it off, along with Pearl-Handed Revolver, which is our next heart. Pearl-Handed Revolver, again, core box generic card. You're going to be running this card in a lot of decks. It just turns a dude into a stud. We do have some high bullet dudes, like Eric and Lucy here, who can take advantage of being a stud. Being a stud is important, not only because it's good, but because we're also running Point Blanks. Roan, again, synergy with cards that we've already talked about. It allows you to join a posse with an unbooted dude without them booting. So unbooted dudes can use Pistol Whip, unbooted dudes can use Point Blank. It allows us to take advantage of some of the downsides of our cards by just allowing us to ignore them, essentially. It's also a horse, which has some minor tactical synergy against horse decks, depending on what they're running. Going through the rest of our list very quickly here, we do run 10 deeds. It's a very strong amount of deeds to run. I would highly recommend the bottom of your deed. I highly recommend that the least amount of deeds that you run in most decks be 10, especially if you're a brand new player and are looking for, like, how many deeds should I have? Well, 10 should be the bottom, and you want to run higher than that when possible. We are running all on value deeds, nothing off value. The 8 is, remember, our weaker value. We do have a couple of deeds that are worth mentioning, but for the most part, They are just there to produce control points, which allow us to win the game, and economy, which also allows us to win the game by allowing us to play our powerful cards. Charlie's Place can give us some extra bullets, which again can let us have more powerful point blanks. We can also use Roan to get off of some of these deeds that require us to be on them. Gamora Gazette has synergy with our home. When dudes get wanted, you can use the Gamora Gazette to make a little bit of extra cash. And Pearlie's Palace is just a powerful tool in general. It allows us to take a shootout action before the first shootout play happens, which means that if our opponent is running something like a shotgun deck or something that we're particularly scared of, we can pistol whip or faster on the draw to make those things a little bit worse. And that's pretty much all you need to know for deeds. Like I said, most of them are just there to produce control points and money, and they all do that. We don't have any 0 control point deeds, if I am not mistaken. Going through the dudes, again, mostly on value. We have a lot of just generically powerful dudes, cheap studs, cheap influence. That's what we're looking for, and we have it in spades. We also have a lot of powerful dudes like Thunderboy and Lucy, all with 2 influence. We have quite a bit of backup influence, as well as a couple of throwaway dudes in Willamay and Christine Perfect. We have Stephen Wiles as an R8 dude. He's just a generically good dude, and his upkeep allows you to get rid of him and keep him as an on-value dude in your deck as often as you play him. Going through our starting posse, we have Philip Swinford, Tommy Harden, Padre Ernesto, Henry Morin, and Hattie Delore. Philip and Tommy are both just pretty standard starting posse dudes for Law Dogs. They both have sort of complementary abilities. Philip is a 1 brass, 1 influence deputy with a ability that triggers every time your opponent reveals a cheating hand and you are legal. Most of the time you're going to be taking advantage of Philip when you have a faster on the draw. It can turn him into a 2 stud because he is a deputy. And you're going to be taking advantage of his minor card cycling ability during low ball. So pay attention to when your opponent cheats during low ball and when your hand is legal. You can also use them in shootouts, obviously. However, a lot of people forget the low ball aspect of this, and I would highly recommend that you do not. Tommy Harden is another anti-cheating dude. He's a 1 stud, 1 influence deputy. Faster on the draw is a little bit weaker with him, but if our opponent has a way of turning him into a draw, we can turn him back into a stud with faster on the draw, which can sometimes come up. His anti-cheating ability is very similar to Quick Draw Handgun, in that most of the time your opponent won't directly cheat into him on purpose. However, in situations where your opponent might have to cheat, he can be a very strong anti-cheating passive, because he doesn't technically count as an anti-cheating card, or a cheating resolution, I should say, and just passively punishes your opponent for cheating. Doubly so if your hand is also legal. Padre Ernesto, we can't take advantage of anything that this dude does. He is not a deputy. He's a blessed 1. We do not have any miracles in our deck. We do not have a miracle, so we can't take advantage of his passive. So why run him? Well, basically, he's just a good stat line. He's a 0 stud, 1 influence dude. He doesn't have upkeep. We can give him a bullet with a quick draw handgun or a faster on the draw. Even if we're not turning a dude into a stud, we can make him a better stud. And he's a very good dude to use pistol whip with, because he doesn't have any bullets, and so his bullets can't be reduced. Just a generically good guy. Henry Morin is a little bit interesting in this particular deck. He is a 2 brass dude who is a 10, which means he is one of our highest value dudes in the deck, which means that he is more immune to things like shotgun that are somewhat problematic for our starting posse. Henry's biggest downside is that his ability, while it's the most common reason to run him in a lot of decks, which allows us to, if we cheat during low ball, we can swap our hand for a new hand in low ball. That isn't really something we care about. Our structure is very low value, so we're likely to win low ball. Our structure is a little bit weaker than some other decks that we'll run into, and so his ability is not particularly useful. However, him being a 10, costing 1 and having 2 brass bullets is very, very useful to us, especially if we can get something like a Pearl-handed revolver on him. So basically what I'm saying is find a place to park Henry and hope that you don't cheat during low ball, because he's a very useful tool, and you can also sack him to soak casualties in a fight, which is also good. Hattie is a queen, again, a high value dude for a little bit of tech against shootout decks. And the other thing that she does is that she is a deputy, so we can use faster on the draw with her and give her point blank. Her shootout ability is also extremely powerful. One opposing wanted dude gets -5 bullets. The downside of that in this particular deck is that most of the time we are going to be using our home to punish our opponent's starting influence, our opponent's cheap dudes, somewhat looking like this, like Philip Swinford, 3-cost, 1 influence dudes that can't really fight without card effects. Hattie, our home is primarily going to be used to target that. But if you ever find yourself in a position where you have an opportunity to boot and make your opponent's biggest stud wanted, giving them -5 bullets for the entire game basically takes them out of commission, which is very, very powerful. And so that's our starting posse. Now, obviously, this is not the end-all, be-all this is not the only way to run this deck. There's a huge amount of values and a huge amount of starting posses and a huge amount of tricks that you can do to take advantage of this Bounty Hunter card, because it's very, very impactful. And we thought we'd just show you one of the ways that we've come up with to take advantage of this. There's, for example, a lot of people like to run Thunderboy in their starting posses. We're not running him in our starting posse, we're running him in the deck, but he's obviously a very, very powerful card, and a lot of people will take advantage of that. However, this has been the first video for us. Hopefully you guys liked it. Consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribe if you do like it. Give us a thumbs down, tell us why you hate it in the comments if you hated it. Either way, we want to see you in the comments, and we'll see you next time.